This is Suno India production. You can now listen to all our episodes on our Android and iPhone app. Download it now.
And also drinking water from the puddles on the ground because there was no other source of water. It was great tragedy, and we didn't like that being friends one day and enemies next. You can't even imagine. We left everything and we got friends and relations got killed, and it happened both sides of the border. Although we got independence, they say, oh, we are independent now, but what good it was when you have lost everything.
That's a short clip from a BBC documentary on partition. Back in 1947, partition scattered people across the subcontinent and raised questions of belonging and loyalty. At the same time, the Constituent Assembly of India was trying to decide who was Indian, who belonged in this nation. In this two-part episode, we look at the thorny issue of citizenship and how the Constituent Assembly approached it. In part 1, we explore themes of partition and belonging. How did the partition impact loyalty and identity in the subcontinent? And how did the Assembly deal with the violence and mistrust in this country? In part 2, we'll explore the creation of the electoral roll and how citizenship was perceived and contested in the state of Assam.
Hello and welcome to Contested Nation, a podcast that discusses how the Constitution of India was written and how that remains relevant for India today. I'm Shruti, your host. This podcast is produced by Suno India in collaboration with the Equals Project.
It is for you to consider whether our conception of citizenship should be universal or should be racial or should be sectarian. That's Alladi Krishnaswamy Iyer in the Constituent Assembly debates on 29th April 1947. Defining who would be an Indian citizen was a question that consumed the Constituent Assembly. Broadly speaking, the debates on citizenship can be divided into two parts: pre-partition and post-partition. When the clause on citizenship was first introduced in the Assembly in April 1947, the partition of India had not taken place yet. Many administrative points of contention were raised in the Assembly. What would happen if a foreign citizen was visiting India and gave birth here? What if an Indian citizen was traveling abroad and gave birth on foreign soil? Would the Indian definition of citizenship accept dual nationalities? Ultimately, these questions revolved around two principles: a universal democratic principle of citizenship, extending it to people who wanted it, with some conditions, and the second being a racial principle of citizenship, which limited citizenship to those who were citizens by blood. The Assembly found itself unable to resolve this question of nationality and decided to appoint yet another committee to look over the matter.
I suggest that in addition to 3 lawyers, one man of common sense should also be added.
And I do not exclude lawyers from the category of people of common sense.
That's an extract from the Rajya Sabha TV series Samvidhan, documenting the proceedings of the Constituent Assembly. By the time the Assembly came back to discuss the citizenship clause in 1948, emotions on the ground were charged and violent. The nation and the Assembly members themselves were riddled with anxiety, suspicion, and distrust. And this bitterness found its full expression in the citizenship debate.
The frenzy and intensity of communal violence have overtaken men, women, and children over a wide stretch of territory. Untold human sufferings and unspeakable brutalities have been inflicted. In short, there has been a virtual slaughter of innocents, of which we shall have to revert to the Middle Ages to find a historical parallel.
That's an excerpt from Sardar Patel's speech in 1947, shortly after independence. To discuss citizenship and partition in India is Ganeev Kaur Dhillon. Ganeev is a lawyer who's passionate about history. She's one of the founding curators of the Partition Museum in Amritsar. So, Ganeev, let's start there. As the assembly was trying to create this identity of who was Indian, there's also parallelly an idea outside the assembly of who is not Indian, who is the other, right? And what let's talk a little bit about what happened outside the assembly between April 1947, when the assembly first discusses citizenship, and 1948, when the assembly and the subcommittee come back with revised citizenship provisions. What's happened on the ground? What has been the real impact of partition?
India and Pakistan as two newly independent nations come into existence in August 1947. But violence had already started breaking out in different parts of the subcontinent by then. Infamously, in 1946, you'd had the Direct Action Day riots in Calcutta and Bengal. These had been followed by large-scale riots in Bihar, subsequently in Uttar Pradesh. In March 1947, Lahore witnesses, in March 1947, the Northwest Frontier Province witnesses the first extreme violence against Hindus and Sikhs. And the movement of people slowly starts happening even then. But it is in August when the partition is announced formally and the two countries have come into existence that the violence goes up many notches. Interestingly, the partition boundaries, the new boundaries of the two nation states, are announced only on August 17th, 3 days or 2 days after the independence of Pakistan and India, because the British did not want to be in charge when the announcement happened, because they knew that violence would increase after that. So on the effect of this is different in different parts of the country. On the western border with Punjab, the violence is immediate. It is extreme, and it is these stories that are most prominent in the histories that we read about or know about, the photographs, the films, the books that are the most known about the partition. And there is almost complete movement of Hindus and Sikhs from West Punjab, which is now in Pakistan, the Northwest Frontier Province, into East Punjab, which is in India. And similarly, almost all Muslims who lived in East Punjab at that time move to Pakistan, and there are huge massacres that take place on both sides of the border. It's also important to remember that at that time, East Punjab would have included present-day Punjab, Haryana, Himachal Pradesh, and Delhi. So in 1947, between August to say about October, November, the movement of people takes place in a really intense manner, accompanied by extreme forms of violence against both sides against each other. On the eastern border in Bengal, the story is different. There had been extreme violence in 1946, but Mahatma Gandhi then moves to Bengal. He spends a large part of 1947 in Bengal, helping keep the violence under check, trying to reconcile people, rehabilitate people. And there is not much violence on the Bengal side in 1947. And therefore, there is not that much movement of people that happens during this period of time. In Sindh, again, the violence does not break out at the time of partition. The Sindhi culture was different from Punjabis or Bengalis. and they were very proud of their own syncretic culture. And many Hindu families chose to stay on even after independence had been announced. Some might have decided to send the women and the children to Bombay or across the border to India, but many of the men continued living there. It's only when, after a few months, when Muslim refugees from India start arriving in Sindh, that and they're fighting over the resources, and they feel, why are these Hindus here? That the Hindus start moving out from Sindh. It is particularly in January and February 1948, when there are instances of violence that break out in Karachi and around Sindh, that a large-scale migration of Hindus occurs, and largely into Bombay. All these stories, again, that we usually hear about and read about are told from the perspective of and sharing the oral histories of middle class and upper middle class families. How partition affected Dalits is very different. Often, Dalits might not have uh, considered themselves as either Hindus or Muslims. They may have converted to Christianity even before the partition, and in many instances considered themselves removed from the violence that was happening, that it did not affect them or was not something that was that concerned them. For many of the Dalits who did come across as refugees to India, they faced discrimination even in the refugee camps. They would not be housed in the best part of the camp. They would usually be given space on the outer edges of the camp. They would not get the full rations, or the complete bedding. And B.R. Ambedkar, in fact, writes to Nehru complaining about this, that, that the Dalits are not being treated equally. And you can see that the same caste and class problems that existed pre-partition were reflected even amongst the refugees who had come across, ostensibly equally, everyone having lost everything.
It's interesting because in our previous episode we speak a little bit about Jogendranath Mandal, his move to Pakistan with the hope that Dalits would get a more equal future in Pakistan when compared to India, and the caste discrimination in India. But unfortunately, that's a hope that doesn't realize itself. Ultimately, both in India and Pakistan, Dalits are treated poorly, and it seems like even within partition and even within these refugee camps that are set up, the same pattern of discrimination against certain identities and certain minorities seems to replicate itself.
Yeah, so you do see that in the migration that happens. It is, in one sense, it seems as if even after independence, the nation state worked towards keeping the same class control and caste structures in place that had always existed. So there wasn't a huge change in the social structure, was not something that was envisaged following independence.
मैं वापस नहीं जाऊंगी। इस दफे कोई माई का लाल महमूदा बेगम को हथकड़ी लगाकर सरहद पार नहीं कराएगा। हजार बार रुके हम,
हजार बार चले। That's a short excerpt from the Shyam Benegal movie Mamo, which tells the story of a Muslim woman from Bombay who migrates to Pakistan during partition, but is forever stuck between the two nations, with her heart, family, and memories belonging to both sides of the border.
The Muslims in India are completely considered as a separate category by the government. They are expected to make a decision clearly and cleanly on whether they want to choose Pakistan or whether they have decided to stay on in India. And any change in their minds later on, for whatever reason, is considered a mark against them. Once you've chosen Pakistan, you cannot choose to come back to India because you would be looked at with suspicion. You wouldn't be considered a true Indian. And once you chose India and decided that no, you wanted to go to Pakistan, you were expected to just go out and not have any dealings with India subsequently. And then you have the women of all religions who were not really given a choice in choosing their country that they wanted to belong to, because their domicile was linked to the domicile that either their father or their husband would choose. And this caused a problem for many of the women. Again, for the Muslim women, this was they were disproportionately affected, because if their husband chose to move to Pakistan, even if their own natal family continued to live in India, they might have wanted to stay in India. They did not have that choice. And once they moved to Pakistan, movement across the border, of course, became extremely difficult. So they were completely cut off and they didn't really have a choice in this matter. So what you see is that what is common to all of the people, all of these groups of people, is that to a large extent, people did not expect that they would need to move. There was this belief in Punjab, it was said that, hukumat badaldi hai, log thodi utke jande hai, that the state or the government changes. It has always changed. We've had different kinds of rulers, different kings of different religions at different points of time. But the people remain where they are. They don't have to ever leave. So even if Pakistan gets formed, we don't have to leave and go. Like the state, like it's a matter that's happening at a higher level. How does it affect the people themselves? So there was that, uh, disconnect between that in people's minds between what was happening at the political level and how that would affect them personally. And the movement of people truly happens only when it starts affecting each of them personally. In Punjab, it happens when the violence breaks out there, and it is felt extremely necessary to move. So you have people choosing to live on in their villages until very often their neighbors come and tell them that, now it is extremely difficult for us to keep you safe, or we've heard that a neighboring village is going to attack you, or the people themselves feel that now they're no longer welcome and they choose to move only then, or when they hear that their relatives have been attacked in a different village and they start feeling unsafe. Similarly, in Bengal, as I said, there wasn't much movement in 1947-48 movement. There is a huge migration that happens in 1950, when there are a lot of Dalits, tribals, and the poorer people who choose to migrate, including Jogendranath Mandal, whom you just mentioned. He also chooses to migrate to India in 1950. And then in 1952, when India and Pakistan are discussing introducing the passport system, that's when large-scale migration happens between East Pakistan and India, because people are scared that they'll be cut off from their family or connections and will not have a chance to move again. In Sindh, migration happens when violence breaks out in 1948, January, February, early 1948. Many Muslims would choose to stay on in India. Subsequently, when they started feeling unsafe or they felt all their family connections were breaking up, half the family might have moved to Pakistan, half was left behind. There were all kinds of rumors floating around about what was happening, and there was fear in the air. That's when a lot of families chose to move. So it wasn't something that automatically happened or was expected or was known they would have to do. And it's very interesting that even for many of the Muslim League leaders, a majority of them belong to Uttar Pradesh, they never thought that they would ever need to leave their homes to go to Pakistan. So it was never something that people thought they would need to do or leave or migrate.
How the state viewed these different classes of citizens. You very clearly articulated the different waves of movement both into India and Pakistan that were happening with partition, and the choice or relative lack of choice that was available to different groups of people, whether that was women, Dalits, people coming in from East or West Pakistan. I'm curious whether you see any difference in your work in how the state treated these different classes of refugees or citizens who are moving into India. Was some more, should we say, desirable than others?
Yes, certainly. I think on the western border, because the violence was within a short period of time, in an intense form, it captured the headlines, even internationally. And the people who, a lot of the refugees who came in from West Punjab to India were well educated, rich people, because West Punjab was the more developed part of the province of Punjab at that time. And so when they came across, they demanded their rights. They felt that, they needed to be, they almost felt that, they had paid the price of freedom, and therefore they deserved to be given special treatment and should be recompensed by the Indian government. And they demanded those rights in different forms. They wrote a lot of letters to the government. There were a lot of dharnas in Delhi. To a large extent, they did receive help from the government to settle again, to resettle. Of course, they never felt it was sufficient. They had lost a lot more than what they got in India, but they did receive government aid and an acceptance that these were people who had lost everything and come, and therefore they did need some help in resettling. And this included small things like giving them loans, educational loans, or like not having to pay when they were getting a document from the government. There was the evacuee land that was distributed amongst the refugees who came in. But what we also see is that on the eastern border with Bengal, there is no such understanding by the government when the Bengali refugees from East Pakistan migrate to India, because they don't migrate in 47. Since there are some people, of course, who do migrate, but these are mostly the middle class, educated Hindus who probably already had some connections with Calcutta. They might have family or business association, and who found it relatively easier to migrate at the time of partition. But a large majority choose to stay back. So if you look at the population of Hindus in East Pakistan in 1947, it's almost 22%. So, a lot of people didn't choose to move right then. But subsequently, when they do choose to move in 1950, 1952, through the 1960s and 1971, the Indian government views them as economic refugees, people who don't necessarily need to move, but are choosing to move. And therefore, they're not welcome. There is a continuous attempt to try and send them back. And when they do come in, they want to settle in West Bengal because that is the closest cultural association that they have. Like, they speak the language, the culture is relatively similar. But very often they are sent off, and they're given space to settle across India, including the Andaman Islands, in present-day Chhattisgarh, in Tripura, Assam. And there's a very hostile relationship that exists between them and the government. The state of West Bengal feels that this is not just their problem, but a problem for the state, for the entire nation of India, and therefore they should be settled anywhere in India. And what the wishes and desires of the people of these people who are migrating is never really taken into consideration. The Sindhis, when they are migrating, their migration is also not viewed as necessary. So you have these different legal acts being passed at that time, including the Bombay Refugee Act, which restricted where the refugees could live. The government had the right to evict them from refugee camps. The refugees had to carry their registration documents on them at all times. And this act was declared invalid later after a case was filed. But, they had to continuously fight for their rights to be accepted. The Sindhi language could be written either in the Devanagari script, which is what Hindi is written in, or in the Perso-Arabic script. Sindhi has its own script, which has its own additional alphabets added to the Perso-Arabic script. And in 1947, the Indian government only recognized the Devanagari script for Sindhi. And this again led to a huge involvement from the Sindhi community to have the Perso-Arabic script also recognized as part of the Sindhi language. Sindhi was included in the list of languages recognized by the Constitution of India only in 1967, again after a huge movement within the Sindhi community, raising it with different levels of the Indian government over the decades. So the Dalits, of course, never really have this, never really have this opportunity to raise the demands and these issues which many of the other refugee groups are raising, because nobody ever asks them what they want or thinks that priority needs to be given to them. They do fight at local levels often. You have different people trying to help them, but it's at a much smaller and individual scale than what you see with these other groups. For the Muslims, there is never this understanding or dialogue that really happens with the government. You have some people who try and have the government consider individual cases as well as the overall picture, but it's always considered and viewed with suspicion.
I think to me, this what you bring out here, Ganeev, is so fascinating because both within common imagination and within the assembly itself, nobody is really talking about the different types of refugees, what their experiences and needs might be. Now, the focus is on the religious question, the Muslim identity, the Pakistani identity, this Indian identity, Hindu identity, but not much more than that, right? It's either Muslim versus Hindu or Indian versus Pakistan in the way that this narrative is framed. And also, there's very limited imagination of how citizenship or partition is going to affect people outside of India's eastern and western borders. A movie, Ganeev, that you told me about, this really great Malayalam movie called Pardesi, which stars Mohanlal and is about this man from Malabar in Kerala who moves to Karachi pre partition and is working there. After partition, he comes back to Kerala, but he doesn't get his Indian passport. And it really follows him over a 40, 50-year journey where he is consistently, even though he's in Kerala, trying to assert his Indian identity, get official documentation around it, but also faces immense harassment from the police, that questioning of his identity, his citizenship throughout his lifetime. So I think what that movie does really well is talk about how this moment in time, this, partition and these closing of borders may have happened in on that one day on 15th August 1947, or the day that the borders were officially announced. But the repercussions of what that means for people's lives and citizenships continues till date and continues to haunt them for the rest of their lives, something that I don't think the state ever truly grapples with.
Yeah, definitely. And as you mentioned, it's a really great film because I think like the effect of partition on South India is often something that is ignored, while there is a huge Muslim population that is present and was present in South India, in the entire southern part of India. And it's one of my favorite films on the partition because I think it very beautifully depicts that continuous search for an identity and a homeland that Mohanlal is very clear that Kerala is his home and he wants to come back there, but it's just not, that is not sufficient. It's not recognized.
When the assembly comes back to discussing citizenship, largely in 1948 and 1949, the simple clause that was introduced in early 1947 was no longer enough. Like you've discussed, Ganeev, a lot of complicated administrative, human resettlement is happening within the country, and this drastically changes how the assembly itself is looking at citizenship. While discussing the citizenship clause, there's consensus that a more detailed law on citizenship is needed, but this is something for an elected parliament in independent India to do, and not necessarily something the assembly itself can tackle. Interestingly, in 1948 is when the assembly sees these claims for religious citizenship being made. Gurmukh Singh Musafir, who later goes on to become a chief minister of Punjab, argues that Sikhs and Hindus from Pakistan should have an inherent right to citizenship in India. It shouldn't matter when they entered the country, who they were before, they should automatically be considered citizens of India. P.S. Deshmukh, a future cabinet minister, proposes that any Hindu or Sikh should have the right to citizenship in India, irrespective of region. And this right is solely based on their religion alone. Now, there were many who were in support of this idea. And the rationale being that India should be seen as a Hindu homeland in opposition to Pakistan, which was now seen as the Muslim homeland. So, where will the Hindus and Sikhs go if not to India? Ganeev, I want to explore this idea that Deshmukh is discussing a little more. Do you see any value in what Deshmukh is saying?
This whole question is arising because there is a discussion of and there is a decision on when do we stop letting people become citizens. Like if they enter after a particular point, they will not be citizens. And therefore, we need to allow all Hindus and Sikhs who enter after that point of time to be Indian citizens. And one could question that why did you need that date? I think in one of the Constituent Assembly debates itself, there is a discussion around the fact that if a person is born in India and his homeland and where he was place of birth is in present day India, then why cannot that be sufficient for him to claim Indian citizenship? And I personally do not agree with this viewpoint because I feel like it's a very narrow and rigid way of looking at citizenship that arises from a place of insecurity. And I think India is a stronger, more confident nation that has no reason to be so inward looking. Our country has always been a place where people have come in and settled from all over. And that is what makes it so great and multicultural. And once you go down the route of excluding people, because that is what you do when you say that this limited group of people have this extra right, there is no stopping it. Like you can always exclude further people. So yeah, that's what I feel about it.
And the one issue that seems to have enraged the assembly or members of the assembly the most is this question of individuals who went to Pakistan and then came back to India, or chose Pakistan and then chose India. In the original draft, all these people were allowed Indian citizenship after they got a valid permit from either the Indian embassy or the High Commissioner. And one must know that this isn't an easy process, right, to get this permit. Members who were opposed to this, there's somebody called Jaspat Roy Kapoor in the assembly who says this is an obnoxious clause and that this was rewarding traitors. There are those who oppose this view. They say, look, this was a peculiar circumstances. People were migrating and making life-changing decisions in the face of incredible panic, violence, uncertainty. They weren't quite sure what was going to happen to their property and lives. And they may have taken temporary actions around migration, which they should be allowed to reverse. And, even from what we've seen, both your work and the work of the Partition Museum, is that people weren't quite sure if these decisions that they were making were permanent at the time, right? They were making temporary decisions based on what they saw unfolding around them. But both within and outside the assembly, there's this suspicion around people who have made the decision to migrate and potentially want to come back now. We see this in the press. The press is constantly reporting on documents recovered from passengers when they're either departing to or returning from Pakistan. There's reports of arms found with Muslim officials. Muslim officials are accused of inefficient implementation of government orders, as if there is some religious basis for that and not general administrative incompetence. In one instance, the document that they seize is handwritten letters sent by refugees in Pakistan, urging their relatives in India to say, come away, come back, come to Pakistan now, because the violence in India seems really difficult to deal with and the future is unpredictable. So they're giving them advice on what they should be doing in terms of migration, but this is sort of seen as incriminating documents. Arms that they seize include really simple nondescript items like kerosene, electric batteries, etc. There's a really interesting example of a guard in Uttar Pradesh called Sardar Ali Khan, who makes the choice to move to Pakistan initially, but then he writes to the Partition Council saying, look, I want to revise this decision. My whole family is in Uttar Pradesh. My friends sort of convinced me to choose Pakistan, but I want to revise this decision now. My mother's sick. And his application gets forwarded by Maulana Azad, who's the education minister at the time. He sends it on to Sardar Patel, who's the head of the Partition Council. And Sardar Patel says, no, sorry, you can't change your decision now. You made your decision. Now you just have to go to Pakistan. Not really acknowledging the reality that people were making imperfect decisions in imperfect times without any real understanding of what the impact of this would be. I mean, we face difficulty in like choosing what clothes we are going to wear for the day, and here people were deciding their whole lives and leaving families, properties, etc. I'm curious, Gani, why, what your understanding of why the assembly is so upset over the small minority, right? Of these people who have actually, in terms of sheer numbers, the people who chose Pakistan and then wanted to come back to India is very, very small. In fact, Nehru, in one of the debates, he says the people who came back are merely 2,000 to 3,000 people, the people who received these official permits. But yet the assembly spent so much time talking about this minority, about this idea of loyalty and betrayal that they feel from these people who want to come back. Why did this consume not just the imagination of the assembly, but even outside the assembly? People are so upset by this. What do you think that tells us about how we view belonging and loyalty?
So I think, like, to some extent, one can understand the emotions that arose from the fact that Pakistan had just been created on the basis of religion. And Jinnah's argument had been that, they needed a nation for Muslims, whereas they would not get equal rights in a Hindu majority India. So to some extent, perhaps one can understand the feelings being expressed, but one doesn't have to accept them, right? Because how is it fair to treat an entire community? How is it fair to demonize and unfairly penalize and treat as hostile an entire community and make them the object of hatred and distrust? What I also find extremely interesting is that time and again, you find, at least on the Punjab border, that very soon after the partition, on both sides of the border, there is an acceptance that that was a time of madness, as is the title of a beautiful book by a Pakistani author called Salman Rashid. And people reacted in anger, people took revenge, people killed often their neighbors sometimes, people they knew. And it was something that had happened to make people go mad at that time. Even those who had been involved in that violence showed contrition often for what they had been involved in. And I find it very interesting that amongst the people who had been most directly affected by the violence of partition, there is much less anger against Pakistan very soon after the partition. When you have an entire community being penalized like this, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So if you look at, again, a beautiful film, Garam Hawa, you have the family choosing not to migrate. But because they continuously keep losing out on business, they get moved out of their house, the family is continuously suffering losses. At one point of time, they're like, okay, maybe we need to move to Pakistan because there is no option to live in India.
You are wasting your time in this country. आप पाकिस्तान क्यों नहीं चले जाते? जो भागे हैं, उनकी सजा उन्हें क्यों दी जाए जो ना भागे हैं और ना भागना चाहते हैं?
And at the end, the decision is reversed. Now, if you see that film, you would not at any point think that this person is anti-national, anti-India. He is very deeply an Indian. And he is very proudly an Indian. His decision to move to Pakistan is being dictated by circumstances beyond his control. And he changes it as soon as he can. While I can see why there was a certain feeling of anger and bitterness, which is understandable, I do not understand how that is a fair response to an entire community, especially by members of the legislature who had a duty to all the citizens of India. So, as we just discussed, also, I think like for a lot of Muslims, it was a very difficult decision of choosing Pakistan or not choosing to move. And one of the most famous people that who sort of struggled with it was Bade Ghulam Ali Khan, who was the doyen of the Patiala Gharana of classical music. And he, in 47, chose to move to Pakistan. He went to his hometown, Kasur. But later, in 1957, he chooses to return to India. And you also have someone like Noor Jahan, who was the queen of Indian Bollywood singing at that time. And she chooses Pakistan, and her decision is dictated by wherever her hometown would lie. And because Kasoor went to Pakistan, she says, okay, so then I'll move to Pakistan. And there's also Ahmad Ali, who wrote the beautiful book Twilight in Delhi, which was published in 1940. And in 1944, he had been the professor and the chairman of the Department of English at the Presidency College in Calcutta. In January 1947, he had accepted the position of a visiting professor of English to Nanking in China. And he was there when the partition takes place. And because of miscommunications, misunderstandings between him and the Indian embassy when he's leaving his position and he says, I'm coming back to India, the embassy informs him that he's no longer an Indian citizen. Because at the time of partition, he had not put in his choice of India. And so he's forced to leave from China directly for Pakistan. He settles in Karachi, but he never really feels at home there. For him, home is always Delhi. But he also feels very bitter about this forced decision that was just put on him. And while he doesn't consider Pakistan really as the place that he feels he belongs to, but in some sense, because of that bitterness, he never really thinks of India as or Delhi as his home either. So he's stuck between these two choices that neither of which are really his decision in this case.
And this conundrum of having to constantly prove their loyalty is something that leaders of the Muslim community recognize right after partition, and some would argue even to date in modern India, right? There was a constant need for Muslims to assert both their citizenship and their loyalty. There's Raja of Mahmudabad in Uttar Pradesh, who was very actively associated with the Muslim League, but sort of breaks ties once, this two nation theory and partition comes up. He says all Indian Muslims would go to war for India, even if they had to go to war against Pakistan. There's M.A. Salam, a member of the Madras Legislative Assembly, who says Andhra Muslims are loyal to the Indian Union and shall defend it against anybody to the last drop of their blood. So they're constantly asserting that they are Muslims and they are Indian, which is something that Hindus never have to assert their loyalty. That because of their religion, they're automatically Indian and they don't have to prove it over and over again.
I think in this question, like the questioning of Muslim loyalties is happening even in the months leading up to the partition. And it's important to take into consideration the social and cultural discussions that are happening in India in the decades leading up to the partition. There is as much a creation of an identity of who is a Hindu as there is who is a Muslim. And there is, of course, much academic writing on it, which explains this much better than I can. But that those identities are being created in these silos that you are one and not the other, and your religious identity is becoming or becomes more predominant at certain points of time. That is an aspect that is equally important to keep in mind when the onus is put on Muslims to prove themselves as worthy of being Indians.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really important point to remember, that this hardening of identities in some way, religious identities, has been happening actually in the decades pre-partition. There's a really interesting anecdote from Begum Shaista Ikramullah, who's one of the two women in the Constituent Assembly of Pakistan. She's she's grown up in India, then she goes to London with her husband and her family, and she comes back to India in the 1940s. And she's in Delhi. Her husband's a Indian civil servant, and she hosts a party. And in the party, her invitation says Begum Ikramullah. And one of her friends, her Hindu friend, says, "Oh, how can you use the title Begum? That's like asserting your Muslim identity." And Shaista Ikramullah is quite shocked. She's like, "But that's like saying Mrs., it's just who I am." And she reflects on this, what she experiences when she comes back to India, this hardening of any sort of allusion to her Muslim identity. Of course, eventually Begum Shaista Ikramullah throws her lot with the Muslim League, moves to Pakistan, has a fairly illustrious political career in the country. But I think speaks to your point, Ganeev, about this hardening of religious identities and religious affiliation that's happening in the decade before partition, and of course comes to some sort of violent outburst with partition itself. In the final draft on citizenship, the Constituent Assembly made a distinction between 5 categories of people. This was fairly complicated. We won't go into all of it, but included people living in India who were born here, residents who were not Indian but resided in India, etc. The question of Pakistan was not left alone. In fact, out of the 5 categories, 3 categories were dedicated to citizens whose legitimacy would be decided based on their relationship or migration to and from Pakistan. But the one thing the Assembly did do was appoint 19th July 1948 as this fairly arbitrary deadline. So anyone who arrived in India on or after this date was not automatically a citizen of India. The Assembly set out a long drawn process for them. They had either proved that their parents or one of their grandparents were born in India. There was a long application for citizenship. They had to prove that they'd lived in India for 6 months and had to get a registration from a government officer. I think we're all familiar with how complicated bureaucracy can be. Ganeev, I want to ask you what your view is on this deadline of 19 July. Within the Assembly itself, the members acknowledge that this is a fairly arbitrary deadline. They've just arrived at it. In your work, what kind of problems do you see it having created? And would there have been a better route, or would any date that the Assembly had set lead to similar problems around, it being arbitrary, it leading to a lot of bureaucracy and discrimination? Could the Assembly have adopted a different route that could have been more inclusive and empathetic?
As far as I am aware, the deadline of July 19th, to the extent I've interviewed people or spoken with them, has never come up as an important date. And I would say there are different reasons for it again, because if you look at the western border, the migration of Hindus and Sikhs who were in West Punjab had happened much before July 1948 to the eastern Punjab. So that migration had already taken place. At the same time, if you look at the migration happening of the migration that takes place of Hindus from East Pakistan to West Bengal, it's something that continues much after July 1948. I have personally, again, never come across this date being something that caused an issue. It was people moved when they could, and the eastern border remained much more porous for much longer than the western border did. It was a problem for the Muslims, but for the Muslims, it was a problem even before this date was decided. They were viewed with suspicion even before this date was was decided on as being a representative of whether you're an Indian citizen or not. So I don't know. I'm not sure how this date specifically created problems at a very individual level. I think what it did do was create on the western border a permit system. And that led to the control of movement and contact between the people on the western side. As I mentioned earlier, people, soon after the violence ended, people on the western border were talking to each other. There were hopes that maybe the borders would or either remain porous. They might be able to go back and forth. Perhaps, there are people who talk about how a friend had taken over their shop or their land and would come every month to the border to give them the money that they had collected, because it was considered as the money of the person who actually owned the shop. So there was this belief that, that kind of owning of property, that kind of connection and contact would continue. And that introduction of the permit system was the first step towards the hardening of the borders, which cuts off that contact. I think that is where I see a greater effect of this 19th July date.
What do you see in terms of hardening of citizenship, loyalty, belonging, whether in India or Pakistan today? Do we still see some sense of nostalgia and belonging across the border, some hope for a porous border? Or do you think today we, as a people on both sides of the border, are pretty settled in our ideas of citizenship and belonging, and that there isn't much longing for the land on the other side of the border?
I think it's for the people who lived through the partition. It is home still remains the place where they were born, and I think that's completely understandable. For anybody to be traumatically cut off from your homeland is going to leave a deep scar. But for a vast majority of the people who lived through the partition, I think there is a huge sense of nostalgia. And in many cases, that nostalgia has been passed down the generations. I don't think it means that they want to be citizens of the other country, whether India or Pakistan. And the history of the last 75 years has been such that that choice doesn't really exist for either Indians or Pakistanis today. But there is still that connection that still, I think, exists. There was this one gentleman, he died last year, and he migrated from Lahore. And I was talking with him, and he mentioned to me that, how can you tell me to not consider Lahore my motherland? Because his mother had passed away before the partition when he was a young boy, and she had been cremated in Lahore. And he felt that, that is my only connection with my mother. That will always be the land that has any connection that still exists for him. So he would take every opportunity he got to go to Lahore. One of the other people that I interviewed was the author Pran Neville. When I was talking with him, he mentioned that, his children say that, his children were living abroad, I think in Singapore or the US. And he said, my children and grandchildren always say that you don't come to visit us, but you always take any chance you get to go for any literary festival, and you just hop across the border to Lahore. And he said, but how do I explain to them that that is a different feeling that I have? And even beyond that, there was this, because of the partition, there were a whole lot of social and cultural connections that were lost, histories that were lost. So when people came across, there was a sense that for India to survive as a nation, we all needed to come together as Indians and make it, in a sense, more homogenous, even as we were a federal country. But another incident that I remember that has always stayed with me is this lady telling me how her father, who had migrated from the northwestern frontier province, after coming across to Punjab and settling in Punjab, he had always, given his mother tongue as Punjabi. And then in the last census, when the person came and said, what's your mother tongue? He said Pashto. And the poor census taker, who was a young guy, was just so taken aback. He'd never heard of this language, and he was like, "Ye kahan ki boli hai? Ye UP ki hai? Like, where is this language from? Is it from UP?" And I always wonder at the decision of this old man in the last days of his life, choosing to connect back with the language of his childhood, something that he probably hadn't spoken for 70 years. And So I think that, that those connections remain for those people. It's not something you can pull out and destroy or remove or forget. Those connections have stayed with the people who lived through those times.
I think that's a fantastic and complicated note to end this conversation on. Thank you, Ganeev, for helping us navigate what is, I think, one of the most difficult issues, not just from a constitutional legal point of view, but from an emotional, cultural, historical point of view. This idea of belonging, of home, of loyalty, and the sort of primal emotions that it continues to evoke in all of us today. Thanks so much.
मुझे अपना घर और दुकान भी देखनी है. कोई कहता है मत जाओ, कोई कहता है चले जाओ. ज्यादा लोग कहते हैं मत जाओ, वहां खतरा है. भाई हमारा वो वहां जन्म हुआ. गुजरावाला अनडिवाइडेड इंडिया. मैं 5 साल पहले भी उनके पास गया था कि मुझे वीसा दो. कहने लगे पाकिस्तान जाके क्या करोगे. मैंने कहा घर है, बड़े हुए तो वहां जाएंगे. जैसे यहां मकान वैसे वहां मकान. कहने लगे फिर हमने वीसा देते. तो मैं चुप करके आ गया. फिर दोबारा गए तो एप्लीकेशन भर के ले गए. 5-7 साल वेट किया.
That was an extract from an interview with Krishan Kumar Khanna on his trip from his current home in India to his birthplace and childhood home in Pakistan, and the 7-year-long process to get a visa to make that trip. That was part 1 of our episode on citizenship, where we explored themes of partition and belonging. A huge thanks to our guest, Ganeev Kaur Dhillon. In part 2 of our episode on citizenship, we'll explore the contestation of citizenship in the state of Assam and the creation of the electoral roll there, and its continued implications for India today. If you like this episode of Contested Nation, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast, and do leave us a review.
Thank you for listening to this episode. You can now listen to all our episodes on our Android and iPhone app. Download it now.